Imagine the first light of dawn stretching across the endless fields of barley, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant murmur of the Tigris River. 5,000 years ago, this was the world of a Mesopotamian farmer, a world where every sunrise meant another day of coaxing life from the soil, of praying to the gods for rain, and of labor that would unknowingly shape the course of human history. These farmers didn't just grow crops, they built the very foundations of civilization, inventing tools, writing, and systems of trade that still echo in our lives today. And yet, their stories are often buried under the dust of time, reduced to footnotes in history books. But what if we could step into their sandals for a moment? What if we could feel the weight of a wooden plow in our hands, taste the coarse barley bread that fueled empires, or hear the songs they sang under the stars after a long day's work? This isn't just a journey into the past, it's a rediscovery of the roots that connect us all. Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, was more than a geographic location. It was a living, breathing society where farmers wrestled with floods, celebrated harvests, and laid the groundwork for cities, laws, and even the concept of time itself. Their innovations weren't just practical, they were revolutionary. The irrigation canals they dug with bare hands turned deserts into bread baskets. The cuneiform script they invented to track grain harvests became the blueprint for all written language. And the community bonds they forged in the fields became the glue that held the world's first cities together. These weren't anonymous figures lost to history. They were people with hopes, struggles, and triumphs as vivid as our own. So why does this matter to us today? Because every time you bite into a loaf of bread, every time you write a note, or even every time you check the calendar, you're touching the legacy of those ancient farmers. Their world wasn't so different from ours. They faced droughts, celebrated festivals, and worried about providing for their families. By uncovering their stories, we're not just learning about the past, we're understanding the unbroken thread of human ingenuity and resilience that ties us to them. So let's walk together along the muddy banks of the Tigris, through the bustling markets of and into the humble mud brick homes where history was quietly made. By the end of this journey, you won't just know about Mesopotamia, you'll feel it, alive and pulsing, in the rhythm of your own heartbeat. Between the winding Tigris and the mighty Euphrates, a strip of land burst forth with life so abundant it changed the course of human history. This was Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent where the soil wasn't just dirt beneath their feet, but a living, breathing partner in survival. Every spring, the rivers swelled with snowmelt from distant mountains, spilling over their banks and blanketing the fields in a layer of silt so rich you could almost watch the barley grow. But nature's generosity came with a price. One year might bring floods that swallowed whole fields, while the next could leave the earth cracked and gasping under a relentless sun. The farmers here didn't just accept these challenges, they outsmarted them. With nothing but wooden shovels and sheer determination, they carved veins of water through the land canals that stretched like outstretched fingers, guiding the river's bounty where it was needed most. Picture the scene, teams of workers knee-deep in mud, singing rhythmic chants as they hauled baskets of earth, their hands calloused but their vision clear. These weren't just ditches, they were the world's first life support system, turning unpredictable wilderness into a patchwork of orderly fields. And with that control came something revolutionary: surplus. For the first time, not every pair of hands had to toil in the soil. Some could build temples, forge tools, or keep records on clay tablets. This is why the Fertile Crescent didn't just grow crops, it grew civilization itself. Cities rose where wheat once swayed, their ziggurats scraping the sky like staircases for the gods. The same irrigation channels that watered barley fields also watered the roots of law, art, and commerce. When a farmer in Ur traded his extra grain for a copper plow, he wasn't just making a deal, he was fueling an economic engine that would span continents. And all of it, every brick and every written word, traced back to those first daring farmers who looked at a floodplain and saw not chaos but possibility. What's most astonishing isn't just what they built, but how little margin for error they had. A single season of failed crops could mean starvation. A breached canal could undo years of labor. Yet they persevered season after season, turning their fragile oasis into the beating heart of human innovation. The Fertile Crescent's legacy isn't just in its soil, but in the stubborn brilliance of those who learned to work with it, proof that civilization doesn't begin with kings or conquests, but with the hands that feed it. Spring in Mesopotamia arrived not with a gentle whisper, but with the urgent clatter of wooden plows biting into damp earth. Farmers guided their oxen through fields still cool from winter, the animals' shoulders straining against harnesses as they carved furrows into the fertile soil. Every movement was precise, too shallow, and seeds would bake in the sun, too deep, and young shoots might never break through. Children followed behind, scattering barley and wheat seeds from woven baskets, their small fingers learning the rhythm of sowing that had sustained generations. Dates, those sweet staples of the Mesopotamian diet, required different care, their palms planted in clusters where irrigation channels could quench their thirst. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, summer transformed the land into an oven. Heat rippled over the fields, threatening to steal moisture from every stalk. But those meticulously maintained canals, some no wider than a man's stride, became lifelines, carrying water from the rivers to the thirstiest corners of the fields. Farmers patrolled these waterways like sentinels, unclogging silt with their hands or diverting flow with makeshift dams of packed mud. Nights brought little relief, but there was comfort in the sound of flowing water and the knowledge that, while other lands withered, their crops survived. Then came autumn, when the air itself seemed to shimmer with urgency. The harvest was a race against time, too slow, and storms could flatten the grain, too hasty, and precious kernels might be lost. Whole villages moved as one, swinging flint-bladed sickles in unison. Women bundled cut stalks while men hauled sheaves to threshing floors where oxen trampled the grain free. Children chased away birds eager to steal the bounty, their laughter mixing with the rhythmic thud of pestles crushing barley into flour. Even the elderly contributed, weaving baskets to hold the yield. This wasn't just work, it was a celebration of collective effort where every hand lightened the load for all. Winter's arrival slowed the pace but never stilled it. In the smoky warmth of mud brick homes, farmers reshaped worn plow tips with fire and stone, or coiled new ropes from reeds. They traded stories of seasons past the year the locusts came, the flood that nearly broke the canals, while planning next year's rotations. Some grain was set aside for planting, some for the temple offerings that ensured divine favor. Even in rest, their minds were tuned to the land's needs, because survival here wasn't just about hard work, it was about harmony with cycles older than memory. This rhythm didn't just feed bodies, it shaped souls. Festivals marked each turning point, planting rites for Nisaba, goddess of grain, harvest dances for Dumuzi, the shepherd god who died and rose with the crops. The calendar itself was a farmer's almanac, its months named for tasks like month of barley eating or month of cutting canals. To live this life was to understand, deep in your bones, that humans were not masters of nature, but partners in an ancient, unending dance. The Mesopotamian farmer's toolkit was a marvel of early engineering, each piece shaped not just by hands, but by generations of problem-solving under the relentless sun. Take the cedar plow, a device so ingenious it bridged two backbreaking tasks into one smooth motion. Picture an ox pulling a wooden frame with a funnel attached. As the plow carved furrows, seeds trickled down through a hollow tube, landing perfectly in the freshly turned earth. This wasn't just efficiency, it was poetry in motion, a dance of human intellect and animal strength that doubled crop yields. But the innovation didn't stop at planting. Harvesting demanded its own brilliance. Flint-bladed sickles, their teeth serrated like miniature saws, sliced through barley stalks with precision. Archaeologists have found these tools polished smooth by countless grips, their edges still sharp enough to cut modern rope. And when the grain was gathered, it wasn't left vulnerable to rats or rain. Farmers stored their hard-won surplus in towering clay silos, their walls lined with bitumen to repel moisture, an ancient version of Tupperware that kept food safe for lean seasons. What's striking isn't just the tools themselves, but how they reveal a society thinking ahead. The Mesopotamians didn't just react to hunger, they engineered solutions to prevent it. Those clay pots, some held ledgers, tiny marks pressed into wet clay tracking who owed what, turning harvests into an early banking system. Even the humble hoe, a stick with a flattened stone tied to its end, evolved into specialized designs for digging canals or breaking clods. Every tool told a story of adaptation. Bronze replaced stone when metallurgy advanced, and wooden axles were greased with animal fat to keep carts rolling smoothly. These farmers were tinkerers too. A broken sickle wasn't tossed aside, its flint teeth were painstakingly re-knapped, a skill passed down like a family recipe. Plow blades were reshaped over fires, their angles adjusted for different soils. This wasn't just maintenance, it was the birth of a maker culture, where every object held potential for reinvention. Perhaps most moving is how these tools connected the practical to the sacred. Plows were blessed in temple ceremonies before planting season, sickles decorated with incantations to Nisaba, goddess of grain. Even the simplest basket wasn't just a container, it was a testament to humanity's pact with the earth, woven from reeds that grew by the same rivers that watered the fields. Holding one of these tools today, you're not just touching history, you're touching the moment civilization learned to turn scarcity into abundance. Barley wasn't just a crop in Mesopotamia, it was the backbone of survival. Tough enough to thrive in soil turned salty by constant irrigation, this humble grain became the ultimate multitasker. Workers received their wages in barley rations, scribes recorded taxes in measures of barley, and even the gods demanded offerings of it. Brewed into beer, it quenched thirst and provided calories. Baked into flatbreads, it filled stomachs after long days in the fields, but its real power lay in predictability. While other crops might fail under the scorching sun, barley pushed through, ensuring that even in lean years no one starved. Wheat, though more finicky, was the gold standard for bread. Grown in smaller quantities on the best-drained soils, its finer flour made lighter loaves a luxury compared to barley's denser texture. Temples hoarded wheat for elite rituals, and wealthy households flaunted it at feasts. Yet both grains shared a sacred role. They were the original staff of life, ground between stone querns into flour that fueled everything from peasant huts to royal kitchens. Then there were the dates, nature's candy growing in towering palm groves along the canals. Clusters of these sticky sweet fruits dripped from the trees, eaten fresh or dried into chewy bundles that could last for months. Packed with energy, they were the perfect field snack, the ancient equivalent of a protein bar. But their uses didn't stop at food. Date pits were crushed for animal feed, and the tree's fronds wove into baskets strong enough to carry bricks. Every part of the plant served a purpose, embodying the Mesopotamian knack for wasting nothing. Beyond the staples, flax fields shimmered blue in the breeze, their slender stalks destined to become linen. Soaked, beaten, and spun into thread, flax clothed everyone from farmers to kings in fabric that breathed under the relentless sun. Sesame, tiny but mighty, pressed into oil that lit lamps, dressed salads, and even waterproofed boats. These crops weren't afterthoughts. They were threads in a vast agricultural tapestry, each one vital to the empire's fabric. Imagine the marketplace at at dawn, farmers unloading sacks of grain, merchants haggling over flax bundles, and cooks sampling sesame oil. A scribe nearby jotted transactions in Cuneiform, 10 measures of barley for 1 copper hoe, transforming crops into currency. This wasn't just trade. It was the birth of an economy where a farmer's harvest could buy tools, jewelry, or even a daughter's dowry. The true marvel wasn't the abundance of these crops, but how they wove a civilization together, one seed at a time. The Tigris and Euphrates were unpredictable giants, capricious gods that could nourish or destroy with the same swirling currents. When spring meltwater rushed down from distant mountains, it didn't politely refill irrigation ditches. It exploded over banks, swallowing fields whole. And when summer droughts came, those same rivers shrank to trickles, leaving crops gasping under the sun. Taming this duality required more than brute force. It demanded a symphony of human ingenuity. Enter the shaduf, a deceptively simple tool that became Mesopotamia's liquid lifeline. Picture a long wooden pole balanced on a crossbeam, like a seesaw with a clay bucket on one end and a counterweight on the other. A farmer would pull the bucket down to scoop river water, then let the weight swing it upward, pouring its contents into a waiting canal. This wasn't just manual labor, it was physics in action, leveraging balance to do what human muscles alone couldn't. A single shaduf could lift nearly 2,000 gallons a day, with nothing but wood, rope, and sweat to power it. But the real marvel lay in the canals themselves, veins of civilization carved into the earth. Some ran straight as arrows for miles, while others branched like fractal patterns across the landscape. Maintenance was a constant battle, silt-clogged channels faster than modern traffic jams. Villages organized cleaning crews, their work synchronized to the lunar calendar. A broken canal wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis that could wipe out a season's food supply. That's why these waterways were more than infrastructure, they were communal bonds, with disputes over water rights settled in courts centuries before Hammurabi's code. Water management blended the sacred and the scientific. Temples employed specialized water priests who monitored river levels, interpreting the god's will in every ripple. Enki, the deity of freshwater, wasn't just worshipped in abstract rituals. Farmers whispered prayers to him while repairing canal banks, offering tiny clay figurines shaped like fish. Even the shaduf's motion held spiritual meaning, its rise and fall mirroring the cyclical nature of life and death. The legacy of this system still flows today. Modern drip irrigation traces its roots to those ancient canals, and the shaduf's design echoes in well pumps used across the global south. But perhaps the most enduring lesson isn't technical, it's philosophical. Mesopotamians understood that controlling water didn't mean dominating nature. It meant dancing with it, adapting to its rhythms while gently redirecting its power. Their canals weren't just feats of engineering, they were dialogues with the earth written in mud and water. To the Mesopotamian farmer, time wasn't measured in abstract numbers, it was written in the language of the heavens. Long before clocks or printed calendars, they tilted their faces toward the night sky, reading the stars like a celestial almanac. The moons waxing and waning carved their year into 12 slices, each month named for the labor it demanded. Month of barley eating, month of cutting canals, month of harvesting flax. This wasn't just timekeeping, it was a conversation with the cosmos, where the rise of certain constellations signaled when to sow or reap. Take the Akitu festival, the thunderous heartbeat of their agricultural year. As the constellation Aries emerged in spring, priests declared the barley harvest imminent. Villages erupted in celebration not just for the coming bounty, but to honor the delicate balance between earth and sky. Processions carried statues of gods through fields, their bases brushed against the first ripe stalks in a ritual as practical as it was sacred. The message was clear: farming wasn't just about human effort, it was a collaboration with forces beyond their control. But this celestial choreography demanded precision. Scribes recorded lunar eclipses on clay tablets, noting how omens affected crops. A delay in the heliacal rising of Sirius, their signal for the annual flood, might prompt frantic canal repairs. Even the zodiac we know today has roots in their star charts, with constellations like Taurus, the bull, mirroring the oxen that plowed their fields. The genius of their system lay in its flexibility. Unlike rigid solar calendars, the lunar months could be adjusted with intercalary months when seasons fell out of sync. Picture a farmer consulting temple priests as they debated adding a 13th month, ensuring the barley wouldn't be planted under a scorching summer sun. This wasn't bureaucracy, it was survival, a dance between celestial mathematics and the dirt beneath their feet. What's astonishing is how deeply astronomy permeated daily life. Market days were scheduled when the moon was full, its light extending bargaining hours. Contracts specified payment when the Pleiades set, tying debts to observable events. Children learned star names alongside crop names, weaving the sky into their cultural DNA. Their legacy lingers in our modern calendar's structure, but we've lost something vital, that intimate kinship with the cosmos. For Mesopotamians, the stars weren't distant specks. They were the original farmer's almanac, a glittering map guiding hands that fed the world's first cities. Every time we glance at a calendar today, we're unknowingly tracing the fingerprints of those ancient sky watchers who taught humanity to mark time by the land's rhythms. A Mesopotamian farmer never worked alone. Even the simplest task hummed with the energy of collective effort. Inside mud brick homes, walls were thin by design, carrying the sounds of neighboring families grinding grain or singing lullabies. These weren't just dwellings, they were threads in a vast social fabric, where every child was raised by the village as much as by their parents. Toddlers trailed after older siblings to gather kindling, while grandparents perched in shaded courtyards, mending fishing nets and recounting tales of legendary floods. The home itself was an ecosystem of labor, mothers kneading dough on stone slabs, fathers repairing reed baskets, and teenagers practicing cuneiform by scratching signs into wet clay. When the harvest moon rose, the entire village transformed into a single organism. Neighbors moved between fields like a well-rehearsed orchestra, men swinging sickles in unison, women bundling sheaves, and children scurrying to carry water skins to the workers. There were no contracts or wages exchanged. This was the unwritten law of reciprocity. If your family helped reap Namu's barley today, his sons would join your date picking tomorrow. Even meals blurred into communal affairs, with households contributing clay pots of stew to shared fires. The scent of cumin and charred flatbread wove through the air as stories passed between mouthfuls, binding generations through shared memory. Temples doubled as social hubs where farmers delivered their tithes of grain and received more than spiritual solace in return. Priests acted as early social workers, redistributing food during droughts and settling disputes over canal access. A farmer might leave an offering for Enlil, then stay to hear news of distant grain prices from travelers, part prayer space, part marketplace, part town hall. Festivals dissolved class lines entirely. When the New Year procession wound through even the wealthiest merchant danced alongside field hands, their bodies painted with the same sacred ash. This interdependence bred a unique code of honor. To betray the community's trust wasn't just shameful, it was existential. A man who neglected his canal digging shift risked seeing his own fields parched later in the season. A woman who hoarded extra flour might find her family excluded from the next wedding feast, yet punishment rarely needed to be formalized. The weight of collective disapproval was lesson enough. What's striking is how fluid roles could be. Women routinely managed estates when husbands were conscripted for royal projects. Elderly farmers became living libraries, reciting planting schedules from memory when floods washed away boundary markers. Even slaves, often debtors working off loans, could earn respect as skilled ironsmiths or weavers. The hierarchy wasn't flat, but it was permeable, with value placed less on status than on contribution to the whole. Modern life has fragmented what Mesopotamians took for granted, that survival and meaning spring from interconnectedness. Their villages thrived not because every individual was self-sufficient, but because every individual was essential. When a child fell ill, the entire neighborhood gathered medicinal herbs. When a canal needed digging, 100 hands appeared without summons. This wasn't idealism. It was the hard-won wisdom of people who knew isolation meant starvation. Their greatest crop wasn't barley or dates, it was community itself, cultivated as deliberately as any field. Oxen weren't just beasts of burden in Mesopotamia, they were the original tractors, their massive shoulders straining against wooden yokes as they pulled plows through sun-baked soil. A single team could till an acre in a day, their hooves churning earth that had nourished generations before them. But these animals were more than muscle, they were investments. A farmer might trade 3 months' worth of barley for a prime ox, then spend evenings rubbing its hide with oil to prevent cracks from the relentless heat. When an ox grew too old for plowing, it wasn't discarded. Its leather became sandals, its bones needles, its sinew bowstrings. Every part honored the years of service given. Sheep told a different story of partnership. Through selective breeding over centuries, Mesopotamians transformed scraggly wild mouflon into flocks, producing wool so fine it became a coveted export. Spring shearing was a festival in itself, with families singing rhythmic shearing songs to keep the animals calm. The best fleeces, creamy white and free of brambles, went to temple workshops where skilled weavers created linen-wool blends light enough for the scorching summers yet warm for chilly riverbank nights. Even the lanolin-rich lower-grade wool found purpose, rubbed into tools to prevent rust or mixed with herbs as a salve for cracked hands. Donkeys were the semi-trucks of the ancient world, their braying caravans connecting farmsteads to cities. A single sturdy donkey could carry 200 pounds of dates to market, its sure-footedness perfect for narrow canal paths where carts would topple. But their value went beyond transport. Donkey milk was prized for its sweetness, and their dung, mixed with straw, became fuel cakes that burned slow and hot in bread ovens. Farmers whispered that a contented donkey herd meant a prosperous household, their presence warding off thieves and evil spirits alike. The hum of bees signaled another kind of wealth. In reed hives plastered with mud, colonies produced honey liquid gold that sweetened everything from medicinal teas to wedding feasts. Before sugarcane reached the ancient world, this was the only concentrated sweetness available, so precious that beehives were often sealed with clay stamps to prevent theft. Beeswax had its own magic, molded into candles that illuminated homes and temples long after sunset. Even dogs held honored roles. Carved into cylinder seals and mentioned in proverbs, these alert guardians patrolled fields against jackals and thieves. Some wore spiked leather collars to protect their throats in fights, while others were trained to herd sheep with precise nips. A farmer might share his evening meal with a favorite hound, tossing scraps to the loyal companion who'd stood watch through 100 moonlit nights. This intricate web of interdependence reveals a profound truth. Mesopotamians didn't see animals as mere resources, but as fellow travelers in the struggle for survival. Veterinary texts detail remedies for sick livestock: willow bark tea for feverish goats, salt licks for ailing cattle. Legal tablets prescribed fines for overworking oxen, and omens warned when sacrificing a spotted lamb might anger the gods. The bond was practical yet sacred, a recognition that humanity's ascent depended on these creatures as much as on irrigation or grain. When a sheepdog died, it might be buried near the family home, its collar placed carefully beside it, a silent thank you for years of service in the endless dance between civilization and nature. The aroma of fresh barley bread baking on hot stones would have greeted a Mesopotamian farmer at dawn, its nutty scent mingling with wood smoke from the courtyard fire. This humble loaf was more than breakfast, it was the edible foundation of civilization, dense with fiber and protein to power hours of back-breaking labor. Made from coarsely ground grain mixed with water and a pinch of salt, the dough was slapped onto curved clay ovens called tanners, emerging with a charred crust that kept it edible for days. Dipped into lentil stew, simmered with onions so pungent they brought tears to the cook's eyes, it became a meal both hearty and practical, requiring no utensils but calloused fingers. Yet even this simple fare carried layers of meaning. The lentils symbolized resilience, able to grow in poor soil where other crops failed. The onions, believed to ward off illness, were medicine as much as flavor. And the dates piled in woven palm leaf baskets, nature's perfect energy bar, their sticky sweetness providing quick calories for midday slumps. Every ingredient told a story of adaptation, a testament to how Mesopotamians turned limited resources into balanced nutrition. When the sun reached its zenith, workers might pause by the canals to unwrap reed-wrapped bundles of fish, catfish or carp speared that morning from the Tigris, salted to preserve them in the blistering heat. Eaten with handfuls of sprouted grain, salad or wild greens foraged from field edges, this was protein that required no livestock slaughter, a sustainable choice echoing across millennia. Even their beer, a thick, porridge-like brew sipped through straws to avoid sediment, served dual purposes. Fermentation killed waterborne pathogens, making it safer than river water, while its carbohydrates replenished spent muscles. But to focus only on peasant meals misses the culinary sophistication bubbling in urban kitchens. Wealthy households feasted on duck roasted with honey and cumin, served on polished bronze platters alongside figs imported from Anatolia. Archaeologists have found spice racks in elite homes containing coriander, mustard, and even turmeric from distant India, proof that Mesopotamia's trade networks tantalized taste buds as well as filled coffers. Tablet recipes describe elaborate meat stews thickened with breadcrumbs, while royal banquets might feature whole lambs stuffed with raisins and pine nuts, their skins glazed with pomegranate molasses. The true artistry lay in preservation techniques that defied the climate. Fish were dried on reed racks until hard as wood, then reconstituted in stews months later. Fruits were sealed in honey like prehistoric jam, while fermented dairy products resembled today's labneh. At the Temple of Inanna in Uruk, excavations revealed giant ceramic vats of pickled vegetables, an ancient pickle factory supplying both gods and bureaucrats. What's most striking is how food wove through every societal layer. A laborer's bread contained the same barley as a priest's sacramental offering, connecting field and altar. Recipes etched in cuneiform show measurements so precise they could be followed today, a delicious thread tying modern cooks to their Bronze Age counterparts. When a Mesopotamian mother taught her daughter to gauge flour by handfuls, or a father showed his son how to pit dates without wasting flesh, they weren't just passing along skills, they were sustaining a culinary tradition that outlasted empires. The table was where farming met philosophy, every bite a silent ode to the land's generosity and human ingenuity. Beer wasn't just a drink in Mesopotamia, it was liquid currency, a form of social glue, and even a medical prescription. Workers building the towering ziggurats of Ur received their daily wages in silos of this fermented barley brew, measured out in precise rations by temple scribes. Thick as porridge and packed with calories, it sustained laborers through brutal shifts under the sun. But this wasn't the crisp, fizzy beverage we know today. Imagine a murky, nutrient-dense gruel, so filled with grain particles that drinkers used slender reed straws, some decorated with lapis lazuli, to sip the liquid while leaving the sludge behind. Archaeologists have found these straws buried in royal tombs, proof that even kings couldn't resist this earthy elixir. The brewing process itself was a sacred alchemy. Women, often priestesses of Ninkasi, the beer goddess, mashed barley into malt, then mixed it with date syrup and water in giant clay vats called fermentation jars. Wild yeast from the air did the rest, transforming humble ingredients into a mildly alcoholic tonic that killed harmful bacteria lurking in river water. This made beer safer to drink than untreated water, a life-saving side effect in a world before germ theory. Medical tablets from the period prescribed beer for everything from digestive woes to childbirth pain, sometimes infused with herbs like myrrh or juniper. A farmer with an upset stomach might gulp down a garlic-infused brew, trusting both its antibacterial properties and Ninkasi's divine blessing. Bread held equal stature in the Mesopotamian diet, baked in domed communal ovens that doubled as neighborhood gathering spots. Unlike modern fluffy loaves, theirs were dense, flat discs of barley or emmer wheat, their crusts blackened from being slapped directly onto scorching oven walls. The sound of dough being kneaded echoed through villages at dawn, often by groups of women singing rhythmic work songs to synchronize their motions. Some bakers added fermented beer froth as a leavening agent, an early form of sourdough starter that lent a tangy depth to each bite. These staples were so central that they blurred the line between meal and ritual. Temple feasts featured bread shaped like divine symbols, while funerary offerings included miniature beer jars for the afterlife. A broken contract might be settled by sharing a loaf and a cup, sealing reconciliation in the most fundamental way possible, through shared sustenance. Even the world's oldest known recipe, etched on a 4,000-year-old cuneiform tablet, is for beer, with instructions so detailed modern brewers have successfully recreated it. What's remarkable is how these humble foods became engines of social complexity. Surplus grain allowed specialization. Not everyone had to farm, so some could become scribes, potters, or soldiers. The need to track beer and bread rations spurred the development of writing, with early cuneiform tablets filled with beer-related accounting. When a farmer bartered his barley harvest for a copper tool, he was participating in an economic system literally built on bread and beer. Picture the end of a harvest day, a weary farmer washing dust from his throat with that thick, malty brew, his calloused hands tearing off a hunk of bread to soak up the last drops. In that moment, he wasn't just consuming calories, he was tasting the very foundation of civilization, a tradition stretching back to the first time someone realized fermented grain could do more than feed the body. it could nourish the soul. The clinking of clay cups and the crackle of bread crusts weren't just sounds of survival, they were the rhythm of human ingenuity turning soil and seed into society itself. To the Mesopotamian farmer, the rustle of barley in the wind wasn't just a natural sound. It was the whisper of Nisaba, the goddess of grain, her presence woven into every stalk. When thunderstorms gathered over the Tigris, they weren't merely weather patterns. They were the fury of Enlil, the storm god, whose moods could drown fields or bless them with life-giving rain. This wasn't superstition, it was a profound recognition that survival depended on forces far beyond human control. Before planting a single seed, farmers pressed tiny clay figurines of Dumuzi, the shepherd god, into the soil, believing his spirit would nourish the roots. Harvest began not with a sickle's first swing, but with offerings of honey and beer poured onto the earth, a toast to the divine partners in their labor. Temples rose like staircases to heaven, their granaries bulging with tithes of grain, part tribute to the gods, part emergency fund for lean years. Priests doubled as agricultural advisors, interpreting omens in sheep livers or the flight patterns of birds to predict the optimal planting week. A cracked clay tablet from Lagash records a farmer's plea to Gula, the healing goddess, after locusts ravaged his fields. "Restore what the jaws of the wind have stolen, and I will weave your name into my daughter's hair ribbon." Even the humble plow was sanctified. Surviving hymns describe ceremonial processions where tools were anointed with cedar oil while chanting echoed across the furrows. The sacred bled into the smallest chores. Women winnowing grain sang hymns to Ashnan, the cereal deity, their sieves moving in rhythm to the verses. Fishermen casting nets into the Euphrates murmured prayers to Enki, Lord of Waters, tossing handfuls of barley into the current as payment for their catch. This wasn't empty ritual, it was a cosmic contract, a reminder that every meal, every harvest was a collaboration between mortal hands and divine will. Archaeologists have uncovered fields strewn with eye idols, small stone amulets buried at plot boundaries to ward off blight. Beneath temple floors, jars of still viable barley seeds were found, sealed with wax and inscribed with spells against weevils. The gods weren't distant overlords, they were as tangible as the mud on a farmer's sandals, their names etched into the very tools that worked the land. When drought cracked the earth, processions carried statues of rain gods through parched fields, their bases dripping with water channeled from the last functioning canals, a desperate symbiosis of irrigation and invocation. What's most striking is how this spirituality fueled innovation. The same farmers who prayed over their plows also engineered precision seed drills. The temples that stored holy grain pioneered the world's first centralized food distribution systems. Faith didn't replace practicality, it deepened it, turning every act of farming into a dialogue between earth and heaven. A broken sickle wasn't just a tool to repair, its metal was smelted with incantations to the forge god, transforming mundane maintenance into sacred craft. This duality shaped their worldview. A successful harvest wasn't just good luck or skill, it was cosmic approval, a sign that the community had upheld its end of the celestial bargain. When floods came anyway, it wasn't evidence of powerless gods, but a call to better decipher divine will. The gods weren't magicians, they were partners in an endless dance of destruction and creation, their rhythms written into the soil, the seasons, and the sweat on every farmer's brow. To work the land was to worship, and to worship was to ensure the land would work with you. The barley spilling over the edges of a Mesopotamian farmer's storage jars wasn't just a sign of a good harvest, it was a ticket to the wider world. Picture a bustling riverside market at dawn, where sacks of grain stamped with family seals sit beside stacks of copper ingots from distant Oman. A farmer might trade 10 measures of barley for a sturdy bronze hoe, or 20 for a length of finely woven linen to clothe his children. But the real magic happened when surplus grain traveled beyond local barter, becoming currency in an exchange network stretching from the Indus Valley to the Egyptian Delta. Lapis lazuli, that dazzling blue stone coveted by kings, made its way to Mesopotamian workshops via caravans funded by nothing more than promises of future grain deliveries. This system demanded trust, and that's where cuneiform pressed into clay became revolutionary. Early tablets from Uruk show simple pictograms of grain stalks and oxen, the first receipts. Over centuries, these evolved into complex contracts specifying interest rates on barley loans or penalties for late deliveries. A farmer might seal a deal with his personal cylinder roll pressed into wet clay, creating a signature as binding as any modern notarization. These records did more than track commerce. They built the framework of credit and accountability that made long-distance trade possible. A merchant in Dilmun could ship copper to earn, knowing the temple scribes would enforce payment in grain come harvest season. The scale of this network still astonishes. Excavated docks at the ancient city of Mari reveal warehouses stacked with cedar logs from Lebanon, tin from Afghanistan, and ivory from Africa, all procured through agricultural surplus. Even mundane crops became global commodities. Sesame oil from Mesopotamian presses flavored feasts in Crete, while dates dried on rooftop racks sweetened porridges as far away as the Indus Valley. The farmer tending his field under the hot sun was unknowingly feeding an economic web that would shape trade routes for millennia. What's often overlooked is how this system elevated the farmer's status. While kings claimed divine right to rule, real power flowed from those who controlled the grain supply. Temples functioned as ancient banks, with priest administrators lending seed barley at planting time and collecting a portion of the harvest. A shrewd farmer could amass influence by consistently producing surplus, using it to acquire land or commission intricate cylinder seals that proclaimed his success. The Epic of Gilgamesh hints at this tension when the king must negotiate with farmers to feed his city, a reminder that even heroes depended on the humility of the harvest. The true legacy of this trade network lies in its democratization of wealth. Unlike gold or silver hoarded by elites, barley was a currency anyone could grow. A widow might pay her debts with baskets of figs from a backyard tree, while a potter could settle accounts with sacks of emmer wheat grown on a tiny plot. This fluidity fostered social mobility unimaginable in later rigid economies. When archaeologists uncover humble graves with imported carnelian beads or Cypriot pottery, they're seeing not just trade goods but dreams bartered into reality, one handful of grain at a time. The first marks pressed into damp clay weren't poetry or prophecies, they were grocery lists. In the storerooms of Uruk, around 5,000 years ago, temple scribes fumbled with small clay tokens, each shaped to represent a specific quantity of grain, oil, or livestock. A cone stood for a measure of barley, a sphere equaled a jar of oil. At first, they kept these tokens in sealed bully hollow clay envelopes until someone had a brilliant thought. Why not imprint the token shapes onto the outside of the envelope before sealing it? That moment of pragmatism birthed the first written symbols, evolving over generations into the wedge-shaped cuneiform script that would record everything from epic poems to property disputes. But this revolution began with something profoundly ordinary: a farmer named Lama delivering his annual grain tax to the temple. As priests poured his barley into towering storage jars, a scribe pressed a stylus into a clay tablet, marking not just the amount, but Lama's name, a squiggly line next to a drawing of a lamb. For the first time in human history, a transaction escaped the fragility of memory, becoming a permanent record. the farmer likely shrugged, more concerned with whether the scribe undercounted his harvest than realizing he'd just participated in the dawn of literacy. The genius of cuneiform lay in its adaptability. Those early accounting symbols soon morphed to capture sounds, then abstract concepts. A drawing of a star could mean heaven, then later the syllable an. Scribes discovered they could combine signs to represent words that had no visual equivalent: love, justice, time. Tablets from the city of Shuruppak reveal this transition in real time. One column lists quantities of grain with simple pictographs, while the next records a legal dispute using complex grammatical constructs. Writing had outgrown its ledger book origins, becoming a mirror for the human mind. What's often overlooked is how this transformed power structures. Pre-writing, knowledge resided in elders' memories, passed orally with all the imperfections that entailed. Now, a temple could enforce contracts across generations. A king's laws could be displayed in town squares, immutable and standardized. When Hammurabi etched his legal code onto an 8-foot stele, he wasn't just declaring justice, he was asserting that words in stone outweighed whispered traditions. Farmers who once relied on communal memory to prove land ownership now held clay deeds with official seals. Yet for all its grandeur, cuneiform remained deeply practical. Excavated tablets from private homes include shopping lists, school children's spelling exercises, even complaints about bad copper deliveries. A particularly relatable tablet from a merchant named Enasir laments the poor quality of ingots he'd received. "Who am I that you treat me with such contempt?" The humanity in these everyday notes bridges millennia, reminding us that writing didn't just serve gods and kings, it gave voice to universal frustrations and joys. The true marvel is how accident birthed eternity. When those first accountants squashed tokens into clay, they couldn't foresee their system would spawn literature like the Epic of Gilgamesh or preserve royal correspondence for archaeologists to decode 4,000 years later. Writing began as a tool for counting bushels of barley and became the scaffold for civilization itself, proof that the most profound revolutions often grow from the humblest needs. Every email sent, every grocery list scribbled today continues the legacy of those ancient scribes who turned accounting into art, one wedge-shaped stroke at a time. The air in Mesopotamia never smelled sweeter than during the Akitu festival, when the scent of roasting sesame oil and honey cakes mingled with the musky perfume of sacred incense. For 12 riotous days at the spring equinox, the entire social order flipped upside down. Slaves dined at their masters' tables, farmers impersonated kings in raucous street theater, and even the statues of gods were paraded from temples on lavishly decorated barges, their jeweled eyes blinking in the sunlight as if awakened for the occasion. At the heart of the celebration lay a profound agricultural truth: the world could only renew itself through controlled chaos, much like the floodwaters that both destroyed and fertilized the fields each year. Harvest festivals pulsed with a different energy, their rhythms mirroring the earth's generosity. When the last sheaf of barley was cut, villagers wove it into an effigy of Nisaba, the grain goddess, crowning it with wildflowers before setting it afloat on the Euphrates. This wasn't mere pageantry. It was a spiritual contract, a promise that next year's sowing would begin where this year's reaping ended. Families laid out first fruit offerings on woven palm mats, plump dates arranged in spiral patterns, sheaves of wheat tied with blue wool ribbons, their very arrangement a language of gratitude. Even the beer flowed differently during these sacred days, brewed from the initial malt of the new crop and strained through cloth embroidered with blessings. Music turned labor into liturgy. Drummers pounded rhythms mimicking the thud of pestles in mortars, while lyre players plucked melodies said to imitate the sound of sprouting seeds. Archaeologists have unearthed silver flutes buried with musicians, their mouthpieces still bearing the faint imprint of long-vanished lips. The songs they played weren't just entertainment, they were living almanacs encoding planting advice in verses about gods wrestling with drought demons or lovers meeting under date palms. A child learning these tunes absorbed centuries of agricultural wisdom as effortlessly as breathing. The social alchemy of these gatherings transformed strangers into kin. During the Feast of Broken Bread, every household contributed loaves to a communal table, deliberately mismatched barley rounds beside wheat squares, coarse peasant loaves next to priestly honey cakes. As families exchanged portions, they also traded stories of the growing season, the canal that nearly failed, the miraculous rain that saved the flax crop. These weren't idle conversations, they were the original cloud storage, preserving vital knowledge in collective memory long before Cuneiform could capture it. What's often forgotten is how these festivals dissolved age barriers. Elders presided over the telling fire, where children acted out myths with puppets made from harvest leftovers. A stalk of wheat became Dumuzi escaping the underworld, a lump of clay molded into the storm god Adad. Teenagers competed in ritualized athletic contests, their foot races along canal banks echoing the speed needed to gather sheaves before storms hit. Even the gods joined in the merriment. Temple texts describe statues being fed ceremonial meals and whispered to about community grievances, blurring the line between divine and mortal revelry. The brilliance of these celebrations lay in their dual purpose. A dance honoring irrigation deities wasn't just worship, it taught proper canal maintenance through choreographed movements mimicking Shaduf operation. The mock battles between flood and drought teams reinforced the delicate balance of water management. When villagers smeared their faces with mud from freshly dredged canals during the festivities, they weren't just being whimsical, they were marking themselves as partners in the land's renewal, their very bodies becoming part of the fertility ritual. These festivals didn't just punctuate the agricultural calendar, they sustained the psychological resilience needed to survive in a landscape of constant uncertainty. After months of backbreaking labor, the sight of their normally stoic neighbors spinning drunkenly under the moonlight, or priests laughing as they fumbled through satirical versions of hymns, reminded everyone that joy wasn't a luxury, it was the mortar holding society together. The laughter echoing through Babylon's streets during these nights wasn't just celebration, it was defiance against despair, proof that even in a world ruled by capricious rivers and scorching suns, humans could still carve out moments of unbridled lightness. The rivers that gave Mesopotamia life could also bring devastation with terrifying speed. One season might see the Tigris rising so gently it barely kissed the canal banks, while the next would unleash torrents that erased entire fields overnight. Farmers told stories of waking to the sound of water swallowing their barley stands, the same silt-rich floods that fertilized the land now drowning months of labor in churning brown waves. Yet even catastrophe carried lessons. Those who survived learned to build granaries on towering mud brick platforms, storing emergency seed stocks where no flood could reach. They mapped the highest ground, marking safe zones with stone cairns where families could flee with their goats when the waters rose. Droughts played a slower but crueler game. When the summer rains failed, the earth cracked into jagged patterns like a shattered clay pot. Canals dwindled to muddy trickles, forcing farmers to abandon outer fields and cluster crops near the few remaining water sources. Cuneiform tablets from describe desperate measures, digging wells so deep the diggers fainted from lack of air, or sacrificing precious livestock to god of freshwater, their blood darkening the parched soil. The cleverest response came not from prayer alone, but from observation. farmers noticed certain barley strains thrived in briny soil where others withered. Through generations of selective saving, they cultivated salt-tolerant varieties that could endure when the irrigation left mineral crusts on the fields. Locusts arrived without warning, their swarms so dense they blotted out the sun. A single day of their ravenous feeding could strip an orchard bare, leaving nothing but twigs and the bitter scent of crushed leaves. Farmers fought back with fire, lighting smoky bonfires to drive the insects toward waiting nets, where they could be gathered and dried as emergency protein. Some villages kept trained birds, their sharp beaks snapping up stray locusts before they could lay eggs for the next plague. But the most effective defense was diversity. Planting figs and pomegranates among the grain meant that even if barley failed, other foods might survive. The silent killer was salinization, a creeping disaster born from their own success. Centuries of irrigation left salt deposits accumulating in the soil, slowly poisoning the land. Tablet records show crop yields declining by nearly 2/3 over 300 years in some regions. Farmers adapted by rotating barley with salt-loving sesame or leaving fields fallow to let rains flush out minerals. In Lhasa, archaeologists found ancient drainage pipes buried beneath fields, an early attempt at soil remediation that speaks to their understanding of ecological balance long before the term existed. What's remarkable isn't that they faced these challenges, but how they turned each crisis into innovation. A flood-damaged field became a chance to redesign canal layouts. A locust swarm inspired new methods of food preservation. When drought killed their primary crops, they foraged wild grasses whose seeds could be ground into hardy flour. Their resilience wasn't just stubbornness, it was a form of wisdom, recognizing that survival meant bending like reeds in the wind rather than breaking like dry branches. Modern farmers battling climate change might recognize this mindset, the unshakable belief that every disaster carries the seed of its own solution, if only you're clever enough to find it. Stepping into a Mesopotamian farmer's home, the first thing you'd notice wasn't the grandeur of the space but its purposeful simplicity. Walls of sun-dried mud bricks mixed with straw for strength rose just high enough to shield the family from scorching winds, their surfaces smoothed by hand and occasionally painted with ochre patterns to ward off evil spirits. The floor was packed earth, polished to a sheen by generations of bare feet and swept clean with reed brooms every dawn. A single room might serve as sleeping quarters, workshop, and dining area all at once, with raised platforms along the walls for sitting or stacking precious storage jars. Privacy as we know it didn't exist. Instead, intimacy was woven into the very architecture, where every whisper and laugh echoed through the shared space. At the heart of the home lay the courtyard, an open-air extension of daily life. Here, a clay oven breathed waves of heat as flatbread baked against its inner walls, while a grindstone nearby bore the grooves of countless barley kernels crushed into flour. Children chased chickens across the hard-packed ground, dodging laundry strung between wooden posts to dry in the relentless sun. This wasn't just utilitarian space. It was a stage for domestic rituals, where women shaped pottery coils into new storage vessels as elders shelled lentils into woven baskets, their fingers moving in rhythms older than memory. The air hummed with the scent of cumin, toasted bread mingling with the earthy musk of wet clay from recently mended water jugs. Furniture was sparse but ingenious. Reed mats woven tight enough to repel scorpions, unrolled at night for sleeping, and rolled by day into makeshift stools. Low wooden stools doubled as tables during meals, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of elbows. Storage wasn't hidden in cabinets but displayed proudly stacked clay pots along the walls held grain, dried fish, and precious sesame oil, their contents labeled with pinched clay markers. A niche near the door might cradle a household shrine, tiny figurines of protective deities beside a lamp fueled by precious sesame oil, its flickering light dancing across fingerprints pressed into the walls during construction centuries earlier. What these homes lacked in material wealth, they made up for in adaptability. During harvest season, the courtyard transformed into a secondary workspace, sheaves of barley spread across mats to dry, while dates destined for preservation simmered in copper cauldrons over open fires. When floods threatened, families hauled their most valuable possessions onto the flat roof, accessed by a notched log ladder, turning it into a temporary refuge. The roof itself was another living space after sundown, where families slept under stars still bright with the constellations their ancestors had named for gods. The true magic of these dwellings lay in their impermanence. Mud bricks eroded over time, requiring constant repair, a process that became a family rite. Children learned to mix straw and mud for new bricks, pressing handprints into the wet clay as signatures. When a house finally crumbled beyond use, its remains weren't cleared away but compacted into the foundation of the next home, layering history like the rings of a tree. Archaeologists excavating these sites today find cooking pots still resting where they were last placed, their contents carbonized by time, proof that these weren't just structures, but vessels for lives fully lived. Perhaps the most striking contrast is how these humble spaces fostered profound social bonds. Without separate rooms, generations coexisted in unbroken connection, grandparents sharing folk remedies with new mothers, toddlers mimicking their siblings' chores, all under one low ceiling. The lack of walls meant no secrets but also no isolation. Grief and joy were communal experiences. When a neighbor's bread burned, the whole village smelled it and arrived with spare loaves. If a child fell ill, the family's shrine lamp burned brighter through the night, its glow visible through the home's single narrow window, a silent beacon of shared worry. These homes teach us that shelter isn't just about blocking wind or rain. It's about creating a container for human connection. The cracks in the mud plaster told stories of earthquakes survived. The soot on the ceiling marked seasons of meals shared, and the handprints on the bricks whispered of love literally pressed into the walls. In an age where we measure comfort by square footage and smart appliances, the Mesopotamian farmer's home stands as a quiet testament to an older truth, that the richest lives are often built not from stone or gold, but from earth, sweat, and the unbroken circle of family voices echoing through the dark. The Mesopotamian farmer's wardrobe was a masterclass in practicality meeting artistry. Knee-length skirts woven from coarse sheep's wool might seem rudimentary at first glance, but every fiber told a story of adaptation. Designed to breathe under the relentless sun, these garments swung freely with each swing of the sickle or heft of the water bucket, their fringed edges brushing against legs tanned deep bronze by fieldwork. What's often overlooked is the ingenuity in their construction. No intricate fasteners or layers, just rectangular swaths of fabric wrapped and belted at the waist, adjustable enough to accommodate the lean seasons when belts might be tightened another notch. Women transformed raw fleece into wearable cloth through a process as rhythmic as the harvest cycle itself. After shearing, they carded wool between spiked paddles, their fingers working out burrs and dirt until the fibers lay smooth as river reeds. Spinning was communal work, done in shaded courtyards where drop spindles whirled like tiny dancers, twisting tufts into strong, even thread. The real magic happened at the loom, where men, often overlooked as textile artisans, worked foot-pedaled horizontal frames, their shuttles flashing back and forth like swallows darting over fields. Surviving cylinder seals depict these weavers bending over their work, creating fabrics dense enough to shield against winter winds, yet loose enough to let summer breezes pass through. Color was more than decoration, it was a language. Madder root yielded warm reds reminiscent of desert sunsets, while crushed indigo leaves produced blues as deep as the twilight sky. A farmer might save his brightest garment, a skirt dyed with precious saffron for market days or festivals, its hue signaling both status and connection to distant trade routes. Even the humblest work clothes bore traces of creativity, geometric patterns woven into the hem or fringe dipped in alternating dyes. These weren't mere clothes, they were canvases where necessity and self-expression intertwined. The care given to these garments reveals their value. Excavations at Ur uncovered tiny clay. Laundry lists notations of repairs needed, like a frayed edge or loose thread. Bone needles and linen thread were household staples, passed down through generations alongside stories of mending a tear during a sandstorm or reinforcing a knee patch before canal digging season. Sandal making was its own craft, with soles cut from tough goat leather and uppers woven from palm fibers, designed to grip slippery canal banks without trapping the desert's scorching heat. What's most striking is how clothing bridged the human and divine. Temple workers wore distinctive tufted skirts, whose wool was ritually cleaned in sacred water before weaving. Farmers dressing for harvest festivals might knot amulets into their fringes, tiny lapis, lazuli beads or copper coils, meant to channel the gods' protection into every stitch. Even the act of spinning carried spiritual weight. Hymns describe the goddess Atu weaving the very fabric of creation on her celestial loom, linking mortal women's daily labor to cosmic order. This everyday artistry challenges modern assumptions about ancient lives. Their clothing wasn't just about covering skin, it wove together identity, community, and resilience. When a mother taught her daughter to spin by firelight or a father traded an extra measure of barley for indigo dye, they weren't just making garments, they were crafting a legacy of ingenuity that would outlast empires. The threads they spun still connect us today, invisible but unbroken, across 5,000 years of human creativity. A child's first lesson in Mesopotamia wasn't memorizing cuneiform signs or reciting royal genealogies. It was learning to distinguish ripe barley from green by the way it bent in the wind. Education here was woven into the fabric of daily survival, where every task doubled as a classroom and every adult became a teacher. Boys as young as 5 trailed behind their fathers in the fields, their small hands struggling to grip the wooden handles of miniature sickles crafted just for them. The rhythm of sowing seeds wasn't just about agriculture, it was arithmetic in action, counting steps between placements to ensure even growth. By the time they could shoulder a water yoke, they'd internalized geometry through canal digging, judging angles by the sun's shadow to maximize water flow. Girls absorbed knowledge through equally practical apprenticeships. Kneading dough beside their mothers, they learned chemistry, how fermented beer froth could lift bread, or how salt ratios preserved fish. Weaving became a crash course in physics, understanding tension and friction as they threaded looms with wool dyed using pigments they'd gathered themselves. Even play had purpose. Clay animal figurines molded by children often matched the species their family relied upon. Oxen for plowing, sheep for wool, turning imagination into reinforcement of vital roles. But formal skills were only half the curriculum. Evenings by the hearth transformed into living history lessons, where grandparents recounted epic tales not just for entertainment, but as encoded survival manuals. The story of Gilgamesh's journey to the cedar forests taught timber selection. Hymns to the goddess Nesaba embedded grain storage tips in their verses. Songs preserved irrigation schedules more accurately than early written records. their melodies acting as mnemonic devices for lunar cycles and flood predictions. A child might not read cuneiform, but they could sing 20 generations worth of planting dates. This oral tradition was anything but casual. Specific tonal patterns marked crucial information. A rising inflection signaled a warning about locust seasons, while a repetitive chorus reinforced proper seed spacing. Proverbs became condensed wisdom. A lazy farmer's shadow grows long before noon taught work ethic, while the canal remembers where the river forgets underscored infrastructure's importance. Storytellers wielded dramatic pauses like modern professors use bolded text, ensuring key points resonated. The system's brilliance lay in its inclusivity. Children with physical limitations might train as oral historians, their sharp ears preserving knowledge others learned through labor. Temple visits exposed all youngsters to advanced concepts. Observing scribes at work sparked curiosity about writing, while watching architects calculate brick counts planted early math seeds. Even failures became teachable moments. A botched beer batch wasn't just wasted grain, but a lesson in microbial control through whispered anecdotes about the time Uncle Enlil's brew turned to vinegar. What modern education often separates theory and practice, intellect and labor Mesopotamians saw as inseparable. A girl mastering cheese making wasn't just feeding her family, she was continuing a biochemical tradition older than cities. A boy singing an irrigation hymn wasn't merely entertaining, he was maintaining infrastructure through melody. Their classrooms had no walls, their textbooks no pages, yet they cultivated a fluency with the natural world that would make most modern graduates envious. The true test of their education wasn't exam scores, but whether the next generation could keep both the crops and the stories alive, a measure they passed so well we're still recounting their lessons 5 millennia later. A Mesopotamian farmer's medicine cabinet didn't sit on a shelf, it grew in his field, simmered in his cooking pot, and whispered to him in temple hymns. When fever spiked through a child's body, mothers reached not for pills but for garlic cloves, crushed into warm goat's milk. The pungent bulb wasn't just flavor. Its sulfur compounds fought infections millennia before scientists identified allicin as nature's antibiotic. Willow bark tea, bitter but effective, eased the aches of aging joints, its salicylic acid foreshadowing modern aspirin. Even beer played medic, its fermentation killing waterborne pathogens while the alcohol dulled pain. These weren't folk remedies, they were the cutting-edge science of their day, honed through generations of observation and survival. Healing transcended the physical in Mesopotamia's holistic worldview. A cough wasn't just a symptom to suppress but a potential sign of divine displeasure. Perhaps the storm god Enlil needed appeasing. Treatments blended practical and spiritual. A poultice of honey and turmeric might dress a wound while a priest chanted incantations to Gula, the healing goddess whose sacred dog licked cleansed injuries. Excavated clay models of livers used for divination reveal astonishing anatomical accuracy, proving these priest-physicians studied disease as meticulously as they studied omens. A sick farmer might receive 3 prescriptions: crushed date pits mixed with thyme for digestion, a prayer to be recited under the new moon, and instructions to avoid canal water for 7 days. The line between pharmacy and kitchen blurred seamlessly. Herbs like coriander and cumin weren't just stew seasonings but digestive aids. Sesame oil massaged into sore muscles doubled as an anti-inflammatory. At Mari, archaeologists found a kitchen-turned clinic where ceramic strainers still held residue of poppy-infused wine. An early anesthetic, women especially held vast medicinal knowledge, passing down recipes for birthing teas from mother to daughter on carefully preserved cuneiform tablets. One such text from Nippur details over 800 treatments, organized by ailment. If a man's skull holds heat like a kiln, begins an entry on migraines prescribing a paste of licorice root and river clay applied at sunset. What's most striking is their recognition of mental health's physical toll. Texts describe heartache as a diagnosable condition treated with music therapy and lavender-scented baths. Insomnia remedies included warm milk with cinnamon, a precursor to modern sleep science paired with rituals to banish nightmares. Even the placebo effect was harnessed knowingly. Amulets inscribed with healing spells often contained actual medicinals in their clay cores, addressing both body and belief. This integrated approach didn't just heal individuals, it sustained communities. During plague outbreaks, quarantined houses were marked with ochre handprints, while healthy neighbors delivered food in long-handled baskets to avoid contact. Midwives trained in both obstetrics and spiritual protection, their birth chants including practical instructions like, "Breathe as the river breathes against its banks." The sick weren't isolated but surrounded by healing sounds, harp music for calming feverish children, rhythmic grinding stones signaling that life continued normally outside their door. Modern medicine often separates science and spirituality, but Mesopotamians understood their interdependence. A broken bone required splinting with reeds and linen, yes, but also prayers that the patient's spirit would knit together like the strands of a date palm. Their legacy lingers not just in our pharmacies where willow bark extracts still soothe headaches, but in our growing recognition that healing flourishes where compassion and chemistry walk hand in hand. When archaeologists unearthed a doctor's grave at Ur, they found his skeleton surrounded by surgical bronze tools and a clay tablet bearing his final prescription. "Let food be thy first medicine, and kindness thy lasting cure." The rumble of marching soldiers was a sound every Mesopotamian farmer dreaded, not just for the violence it heralded, but for the invisible scars it left on the land. When kings called for war, the first casualties weren't always on the battlefield. Fields ripe with barley were trampled into mud by chariot wheels, irrigation canals repurposed as troop trenches, and orchards stripped bare to feed hungry armies. Worse than the physical destruction was the theft of labor. Fathers and sons who should have been guiding plows were handed bronze spears instead, conscripted into conflicts they barely understood. Cuneiform tablets from Lagash record the despair of a widow pleading with officials. "You took my husband for Sargon's war, and now my children eat clay to quiet their hunger." The land suffered too without hands to maintain canals. Once fertile plots reverted to cracked wasteland, undoing generations of careful stewardship. War's financial toll cut just as deep. Temples demanded silver for shields taxes, forcing farmers to sell seed grain or lease their fields to wealthy elites. A tablet from Umma details a man surrendering his ancestral plot to pay war debts, his signature pressed awkwardly into the clay as if his hands shook with grief. Even those who avoided conscription faced ruin, as marauding armies requisitioned livestock and burned storehouses to deny enemies resources. The irony was cruel. The very farmers who fed cities became pawns in wars that destroyed their ability to produce food. Yet resilience flickered like a lamp in the storm. When soldiers finally marched home, those who survived returned not to rest but to rebuild. Broken canal banks were patched with mud and woven reeds. Fields littered with arrowheads were painstakingly cleared, the metal salvaged to forge new plow tips. Women and children left to tend the land during conflicts passed down hard-won knowledge, which wild grasses could be ground into famine bread, how to disguise grain stores in false floor pits. This wasn't just recovery, it was quiet rebellion, a refusal to let war erase their bond with the earth. Archaeologists find poignant evidence of this determination. At the site of ancient Kish, a pottery shard bears the scratched image of a farmer leading his oxen drawn by a soldier during lulls in battle, perhaps dreaming of the fields he'd left behind. Other digs reveal homes rebuilt directly atop rubble, their foundations layered with charred grain as if to consecrate the new beginning. Even kings recognized this unbreakable spirit. Hammurabi's laws included protections for farmers during military campaigns, decreeing that no one could seize a man's oxen or seed during planting season. The true cost of war wasn't measured in lost battles, but in stolen harvests, the years of plenty erased by a single campaign. A cuneiform letter from Mari captures this calculus perfectly. Our army took 5 cities, but the locusts took our barley, and now the people eat their own roofs. Yet every time the soil was replanted, every time a farmer knelt to press seeds into earth still smelling of ash, Mesopotamia reaffirmed a profound truth. Civilizations rise not on the spears of conquerors, but on the calloused hands of those who feed them. The silent endurance of these farmers planting hope in war's wreckage may be history's most overlooked act of courage. The rhythmic scraping of grinding stones echoed through Mesopotamian villages at dawn, a sound as constant as the river's flow and almost always produced by women's hands. While kings and scribes dominated the historical record, it was these unsung heroines who turned raw grain into life itself, their labor pulsing at the heart of civilization's rise. Far from passive bystanders, women were the original agricultural engineers, mastering chemistry as they fermented barley into nourishing beer, and physics as they balanced heavy water jars on their heads during canal repairs. A cuneiform receipt from Lagash reveals a startling fact. Nearly 1/3 of documented landholders in certain districts were women, some managing estates larger than modern city blocks. These weren't exceptions, they were proof of a society that pragmatically valued capability over gender when survival hung in the balance. Consider the brewers, priestesses of Ninkasi who transformed humble grains into sacred sustenance. Their temple breweries functioned as ancient biochemical labs, where women monitored fermentation temperatures by touch and adjusted mash compositions like master alchemists. A hymn from describes their process in reverent detail. You are the one who kneads the dough with sweet aromatics, while the beer dough fills the reed baskets. These women weren't merely cooks, they were keepers of a science so vital it warranted divine patronage. Even their tools reflected sophistication. Archaeologists have unearthed ceramic sieves finer than modern tea strainers, designed to clarify beer while retaining precious nutrients. Household management was another arena of hidden brilliance. A woman directing her family's food storage wasn't just stacking jars, she was executing complex risk calculus. Should she trade surplus dates now for wool before winter, or gamble on higher prices later? How much grain should be reserved for spring planting versus feeding the oxen through drought? Cuneiform tablets from private homes show women calculating rations with precision that would shame modern spreadsheet jockeys, their tallies of sesame oil and dried fish revealing an intimate grasp of nutritional needs across seasons. The textile industry offers perhaps the most vivid proof of women's economic power. From shearing to spinning to dyeing, fabric production was a female-dominated pipeline that clothed empires. At Mari, excavation of a single workshop revealed over 200 spindle whorls, evidence of industrial-scale production run by women entrepreneurs. Some contracts show weavers negotiating prices in silver rather than barter, their signatures pressed confidently alongside male merchants. Even royal correspondence mentions the linen women with a mix of respect and wariness, acknowledging their ability to sway markets by withholding labor. Motherhood itself became an agricultural strategy. Women passed down seed-saving knowledge like trade secrets, teaching daughters which barley heads had the plumpest kernels for replanting. Lullabies doubled as crop rotation reminders, their melodies encoding which fields should lay fallow next year. When locusts came or canals failed, it was often grandmothers who recalled survival techniques from past disasters, how to leach toxins from famine grasses, or which clay deposits made the best emergency grain seals. This intergenerational transfer of wisdom formed an invisible infrastructure as vital as any ziggurat. The legal protections some women secured startle modern expectations. Dowry tablets from Sippar detail orchards and irrigation shares passing from mother to daughter, with husbands legally barred from selling these assets. A divorce decree carved in stone specifies that a woman retained rights to any beer brewing equipment she brought into the marriage, an ancient prenup protecting her livelihood. Even slave women could own property under certain conditions. One tablet records a formerly enslaved woman buying a date palm grove with savings from selling hand-spun yarn. Yet for all their contributions, women's stories were often reduced to footnotes. The same scribes who meticulously recorded barley yields might reduce a female landowner to wife of X in official documents. Artistic depictions show men plowing while women grind grain, never revealing that grinding required more daily calories than plowing, according to biomechanical studies. This selective recognition mirrors a pattern still frustratingly familiar: essential labor made invisible by its very ubiquity. Rediscovering these women reshapes our understanding of antiquity. It wasn't just warrior kings and scribes who built civilization. It was the woman calculating how to stretch 3 months' grain into 5, the widow bartering woven cloth for canal repair labor, the grandmother teaching a toddler to test soil salinity by taste. Their legacy lingers in every modern pantry staple, every fermented food, every thread of fabric. To honor them isn't just historical correction. It's reclaiming the truth that progress has always been a chorus, not a solo, and some of its most vital voices have been humming over grinding stones for millennia. The clatter of wooden game pieces on a scratched clay board might seem an unlikely soundtrack for civilization's first leisure hours, but in the dim glow of a Mesopotamian farmer's oil lamp, the royal game of wasn't just entertainment. It was a battlefield of strategy and luck that mirrored life between the rivers. Excavated boards, their inlaid shell and lapis lazuli squares still vibrant after millennia, reveal a game so beloved it spread across empires from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Players threw knuckler bones like ancient dice, their pieces racing along winding paths that some scholars believe symbolized the soul's journey through the underworld. A particularly dramatic match might draw spectators placing wagers of dried figs or copper rings, their laughter cutting through the evening heat. This wasn't mere distraction. It was cognitive training disguised as play, sharpening the same calculation skills farmers use to predict harvest yields or barter grain prices. Music wove through these moments of respite like a second language. Lyres carved from tamarisk wood, their strings made from stretched sheep gut, produced tones as warm as the setting sun. At Ur's royal cemetery, archaeologists unearthed the famed golden lyre, its bull-headed resonator whispering of nights when musicians plucked melodies mimicking rushing canals or the rustle of barley in the wind. Drums fashioned from stretched goat hide provided heartbeat rhythms for communal dancing, their patterns echoing the thud of pestles in mortars, work transformed into art. Even children participated, shaking sistrums filled with river pebbles to create a sound like rain on dry earth. Storytelling became the living archive of a people without paper. Elders spun tales of Gilgamesh's adventures under star-strewn skies, their voices rising and falling like the Tigris currents. What seemed like simple myths carried layers of practical wisdom. The flood story warned of sudden inundations, while the descent of the goddess Inanna encoded seasonal planting cues. Teenagers reenacted these epics with shadow puppets cast by firelight, their silhouettes dancing on mud brick walls. A particularly gifted storyteller might earn extra rations of beer, their narratives so vivid they temporarily erased the aches of a day spent bent over fields. These activities did more than fill idle hours, they forged social glue. A friendly game could dissolve tensions between neighbors who'd argued over canal water rights. Shared songs preserved regional dialects and histories long before writing could capture them. The act of leisure itself became an act of resistance against despair. When locusts devoured crops or floods erased boundaries, the ability to still gather and laugh reaffirmed humanity's indomitable spirit. Archaeologists find poignant evidence of this balance. At Tel Harmel, a gaming board was discovered beside a skeleton, its pieces frozen mid-play as if death itself had interrupted the game. In another dig, a child's lyre was buried with tiny hands still curled around its broken strings. These artifacts remind us that the Mesopotamians didn't just endure, they savored, creating pockets of joy in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Their greatest innovation might not have been irrigation or writing, but the understanding that culture doesn't flourish in absence of hardship, but in defiant spite of it. The clink of game pieces, the twang of lyres, the rise and fall of storytelling voices, these were the sounds of a people planting flags of delight in the stubborn soil of daily struggle. The Mesopotamian farmer's fingerprints are smudged across every loaf of bread you've ever eaten, every city skyline you've admired, even the words you're hearing right now. That humble cedar plow they invented, its direct descendant rumbles through modern wheat fields as computerized tractors with GPS guidance, still following the same fundamental principle, planting seeds in neat rows for maximum yield. Those labyrinthine irrigation canals that snaked between the Tigris and Euphrates, their ghostly outlines are visible in aerial photos of today's farmland, where laser-leveled fields and drip irrigation systems continue their ancient dance with water scarcity. The Mesopotamians didn't just grow crops, they encoded an agricultural DNA that still replicates in our practices today, from crop rotation schedules to the very concept of storing surplus grain as economic buffer. Consider the unbroken thread linking their clay tablets to your smartphone. When those farmers pressed wedge-shaped marks into wet clay to track barley shipments, they sparked a cognitive revolution, externalizing memory in physical form. That leap from oral tradition to written record didn't just preserve grocery lists, it birthed contracts, literature, and eventually the digital code underpinning modern life. The 3D printed drone spraying fertilizer over a Kansas cornfield owes its existence to a Mesopotamian scribe's obsessive tallying of seed stocks 5,000 years prior. Even our 7-day week traces back to their lunar calendar, its rhythms locked into global culture like circadian rhythms in our cells. Yet their most enduring legacy might be invisible, the very idea of sustained collective effort. Before Mesopotamia, humans hunted and gathered in small bands. These farmers proved that thousands could coordinate around shared infrastructure, with grain taxes funding communal projects like ziggurats and city walls. That social contract contributing to a greater whole in exchange for stability still undergirds everything from highway taxes to public schools. The next time you flip a light switch, remember, you're participating in a system of interdependence those ancient agriculturalists engineered when they pooled labor to dredge canals. What's most humbling is how little our core challenges have changed. They battled soil salinization, we face climate change, they worried about erratic floods. Today's farmers monitor erratic commodity markets. Their solutions: drought-resistant crops, decentralized food storage, cooperative labor read like a playbook for modern resilience. Archaeologists have even found evidence of early crop insurance at Mari, where temple redistributions cushioned bad harvests. Their genius wasn't just inventing tools, but systems to weather uncertainty, a lesson we're relearning in an era of supply chain disruptions. The true measure of their impact lies in what we've forgotten. Most people don't know barley's domestication fueled the first cities, or that the word cereal honors Ceres, the Roman iteration of their grain goddess Nisaba. Few recognize that every time they sign a receipt, they're echoing the cylinder seals pressed into Mesopotamian clay. But this anonymity is the ultimate tribute. Their innovations became so fundamental, they faded into civilization's background like the steady hum of irrigation water. We don't think about them when biting into a sandwich or checking the weather app, yet their worldview permeates these mundane acts. Perhaps their greatest gift was proving that humanity thrives not through domination of nature, but through collaboration with it. Their shadows lifted water without defying gravity. Their lunar calendar worked with celestial cycles rather than against them. In an age grappling with ecological limits, their example whispers across millennia. Progress isn't about conquering the land, but learning its rhythms well enough to dance together. The furrows they plowed still guide us not just in fields, but in the fertile soil of collective imagination, where the seeds they planted continue to bear fruit. The cracked clay bricks of Ur might seem like silent ruins to the untrained eye, but to archaeologists they're shouting stories. When Leonard Woolley's team first brushed away the desert sands in the 1920s, they didn't just uncover a city. They stumbled into a time capsule of Mesopotamian life, frozen mid-moment. One trench revealed a baker's oven, its last loaf carbonized to a crisp, as if the baker had stepped out for water and never returned. Nearby, a child's toy, a miniature wheeled sheep, lay abandoned in the corner of a courtyard, its playful purpose belying the sophistication of the civilization that crafted it. These weren't just relics, they were intimate snapshots of people who laughed, worried, and dreamed much like we do. The real revelation came from the so-called death pits of Ur, where excavators uncovered entire households buried with their possessions. A woman's skeleton wore a headdress of golden leaves so delicate they trembled in the desert breeze when unearthed. Beside her, a cylinder seal carved with her name, Puabi, rolled from the folds of her garment, its tiny inscription transforming her from anonymous bones into a real woman with status and identity. Even the mundane objects spoke volumes. Broken pottery mended with bitumen glue showed thriftiness, while stacks of accounting tablets in cramped scribble offices proved bureaucracy's ancient roots. But perhaps the most haunting finds were the simplest. In a modest home's corner, archaeologists found a clay tablet covered in a child's clumsy cuneiform. School exercises where the writer had painstakingly repeated the same signs over and over, their grooves growing more confident with each attempt. Nearby, fingerprints lingered in the mortar of a doorway, left by a worker smoothing the wet clay 4,000 years ago. These human traces collapse time, bridging the gap between then and now with startling immediacy. You can almost hear the teacher's patient corrections or the worker's quiet humming as he plastered the wall. Modern technology peels back even deeper layers. CT scans of sealed storage jars reveal fossilized grains of barley, their DNA hinting at selective breeding practices. LiDAR mapping exposes entire buried neighborhoods, their irrigation channels still aligned with mathematical precision. Even the dirt holds secret. Soil analysis near hearths identifies ancient spices like coriander and cumin, rewriting assumptions about their trade routes. One team recently used 3D modeling to reconstruct the acoustics of a temple courtyard. proving its design amplified chance to awe-inspiring effect. What makes these discoveries revolutionary isn't their rarity, but their relatability. A broken plow tip displayed in a museum case isn't just a tool. It's evidence of a farmer's frustration when his implement struck hidden rocks. A laundry list scratched into clay isn't merely an early text. It's a busy household manager's attempt to stay organized. These artifacts remind us that history isn't about grand battles or royal decrees alone. It's woven from countless ordinary moments, each as vital as the threads in one of Ur's famous tapestries. The true magic of archaeology lies in its power to democratize the past. Kings left their statues, but the anonymous potter left her thumbprint on a bowl's base. The wealthy were buried with gold, but the poor were buried with their spindle whorls and worn sandals, objects that whisper equally poignant truths about dignity and perseverance. Every shard, every seed, every fingerprint pulls us into an unbroken chain of human experience, proving that while empires rise and fall, the daily rhythms of caring, creating, and surviving remain timeless.